Okay, so I think we'll set the ball rolling. Thank you everyone for coming. It is a pleasure really to talk about today's topic, disorder and dollar dominance under Donald Trump's second presidency. This cannot be more timely topic to present, and we have Professor Photis here going to give us our talk. We have also sort of circulated the paper that'll form the sort of background for this talk. Just 2 seconds or 2 minutes of like mini introduction of what the global disorder is, what CITIPERC is. Global Disorder Cluster, or the Global Disorder Group, is a group that we started in 2022, predominantly from the international relations perspective, like looking at questions on what are the sort of crises in the making of international order, how do we sort of conceptualize new forms of challenges that comes to international order, from climate to sort of problems relating to artificial intelligence, and other sorts of tensions from authoritarian regimes, crisis of democracy, and so on. CITIPERC has a longer tradition here, and it has been going on and it has a huge reputation, not just here in the UK, but also abroad. And this is the first sort of seminar where we both are combining our sort of interests. One is that there is a growing recognition that much of the problems that comes from today's world, particularly in issues of global order and ordering, is probably from economics and economic issues. And there's no one else better to talk about sort of problems that come from dollar other than Photis. He has a recent book that we all sent out in our email. We are sort of also happy to sort of have him sort of send you a discount code as well if you're really interested after this talk to purchase the book. But this talk will not be about the book per se. This talk is something that Photis has been thinking for quite some time in our conversations. One is to both theoretically and empirically understand the connections between the stability of the dollar regime and the financial world and the instability in the political world. And we are going to have Photis talk about that sort of tensions between order and disorder, and sometimes the coexistence of order and disorder, how order really rests on disorder at some level, and how global disorders from climate, environment, or issues relating to wars and others might not necessarily mean that there is disorder at the financial realm as well. And we think this is a fascinating argument for an interdisciplinary sort of research that looks both that the world is tightly interconnected in many ways, and this interconnections is somehow reflected in how certain things, certain status quo is continued in one way or the other, and dollar is one of them. So about 20 to 25 minutes, Photis will make a presentation and pitch. There will be some online questions as well, and there are 2 areas people have signed up. One is the Teams, and we have 2 members here, and some others have signed up in Zoom as well, and they'll send some Q&A. But the point really what Photis wants to do is to have a discussion. So after sort of brief 20 minutes or 25 minutes, we are going to open the floor for really fierce discussion, as Photis' style of discussing is very passionate. So I'll only be doing what is called as sort of a managerial role, being the chair, sort of asking you sort of happy to answer questions that you're directing to Photis. But please introduce yourself when you're asking a question, and then start sort of like your questions, your challenges, your sort of concerns or clarifications. If there are others that I'll have to be paying attention to, I'll be paying attention more to the online sort of Q&A. So without much ado, please welcome Photis.
Thank you, Sashi. Okay. So, over 100 days into Donald Trump's second presidency, there is no doubt that his policies amount to nothing other than wanton vandalism on a global scale. But is this mindless vandalism or vandalism with a purpose? To answer this question, we must first distinguish between the motivating and enabling factors behind Trump's policies. Whatever the precise reasons for them, which I'll come to in a moment, the fact remains that the US is the only country on the planet that has the power to cause disruption on so vast a scale. That power comes down to the unrivaled power of the US dollar in global financial space. First, let's take a look at global physical space. As things stand, the world comprises of 8.2 billion people that are grouped into 195 territorially bordered countries. Although virtually all of these countries now operate to the same capitalist market exchange principles, this physical space is by no means characterized by uniformity and settled order. On the contrary, the entry of China and all of the former communist countries into world capitalism, coupled with ongoing advances in information and transportation technologies, have served to accentuate rivalry and competition between different countries. Developments that, by heralding the decentering of the West after centuries of imperial and neo-imperial control, have in turn served to accentuate fracture and disorder. Here is an image of world physical space. If we look at countries and regions by GDP, and the first thing you see here is indeed a relative decline of the West and a resurgent rise of the East, with China being at its core. But now let's look at global financial space, which by contrast is highly ordered, one that is centered on one dominant country, the USA. If we take the foreign exchange market, the world's largest financial market, that now has a daily turnover of about $7.5 trillion, we find that the US dollar accounts for 44% of this amount, that the euro accounts for 15%, while at the other extreme, all of the emerging market economy currencies put together amount to no more than 13%, account for no more than 13%. The US's percentage share of FX turnover broadly correlates with its percentage shares of world equity and bond stocks. This is the equity market in 2024, 130 trillion. The US on its own accounted for over 74% of that. And similarly, in the case of the global bond market, 142 trillion outstanding 2024, the US on its own accounted for nearly 40%. These are massive size disparities, particularly between the US and the emerging market economies on the other hand. But sizable as are these disparities, they are nothing when translated into currency terms, because the US market exists as a single, same currency denominated mass, whereas other markets, separated according to their local currencies, shrink to vanishingly small fragments by comparison. So, global physical and global financial spaces are mutually antithetic. Physical space, on the one hand, is decentered, with no single region dominant in the global real economy. Global financial space, by contrast, is highly centered on one country, the US, and on its currency, the dollar. Here they are, side by side, these two spaces. But, although they are mutually antithetic, they also interlock in a mutually reinforcing dynamic. Let's look at the connecting line that runs from physical to financial space. The fact that global physical space is characterized by fracture and disorder due to intense regional competition means that it's also highly prone to periodic bouts of uncertainty and confusion, bouts that in turn invariably cause increases in financial flows seeking the safety of US treasuries. In the US itself, these treasury inflows typically come from US equities or high-risk corporate bonds. But on the international front, it is EME currencies, principally government bonds, that are the typical source of funds seeking safe harbor in US treasuries. Global crises, periods of turbulence, serve to amplify these developments by orders of magnitude. As you can see here, in periods of turbulence such as that caused by the great financial crisis, the taper tantrum of 2013, the COVID outbreak, pandemic outbreak 2020. What do you see? Massive outflows from the EME government bonds, with the US Treasury market being the principal recipient of those funds. So now let's look at the connecting line that runs in the reverse direction from global financial space to physical space. If disorder and ensuing uncertainty in this latter physical space always reinforces the dollar's dominance, this dominance in turn puts the US in a position to further magnify disorder and uncertainty in physical space. Why? Because it has this position, it enjoys this position because it is protected from the effects of this disorder to a relatively greater degree than our other countries, due to the pivotal role played by US Treasuries as the world's premier reserve asset. The crux of the matter is that the Trump administration knows that it can afford to wreak havoc in global trade and production, even at the cost of damaging the US's own production base, because it knows that this havoc will not seriously reduce the dollar's backing mass of US Treasuries, thereby threatening its global dominance. Now, April the 2nd, Liberation Day, the tariffs policy unveiled. That moment triggered a spate of predictions that we're going to see the fall of the dollar. Across all the media, all the mainstream press, led by the Financial Times. These are some of the headings all through April. The US dollar's haven status under threat. The dollar has further to fall. Dark days for the less mighty dollar. And on April 28th, Rana Faroha writes this lead article, "The spectre of dollar doomsday still looms." Dollar doomsday? I don't think so. For an end to the dollar safe haven status to happen, foreign central banks and foreign private investors need to offload the bulk of their current dollar assets, and in particular their US Treasury holdings. Let's take that dollar mass and strip it down to its components, as you see there. At its core are US Treasuries and agency bonds, flanked by US corporate bonds, US asset-backed securities, and then 40 trillions worth of equities. Who holds these securities? Well, if we take foreigners, they hold, at that same year, 2022, over a quarter of all US securities outstanding. And when you look at US Treasuries, 7.3 trillion, add another 1.3 trillion agency bonds, and we find that foreigners held over 1/3 of US Treasuries. So, are we going to see a mass exodus from US Treasuries on the scale that will bring about the collapse of the dollar? Well, for this to be possible, there needs to be available an alternative supply of assets that can combine the same three key qualities as have US Treasuries, namely safety, liquidity, and large value storage capacity. There are no such alternative assets. Other government securities, UK gilts, Australian government bonds and so on, combine safety and liquidity, but have comparatively little value storage capacity. Cryptocurrencies may have large value storage capacities, but they lack safety. Gold combines safety with liquidity, but its quantity is materially constrained. The list goes on. So, we come then to the second part of the key question. The US can wreak havoc because it's safe. That's the enabling factor, the permissive factor. What is the cause? What is the motivation behind Trump's vandalism? For an answer to this part of the question, we need to separate out the three major constituencies behind Trump. The largest of these is that proportion of the US's electoral base that has solidly supported Trump because of the strong populist appeal of such of his slogans as America First and Make America Great Again. Now, if we take seriously Trump's insistence that the major aim of his tariffs is to reindustrialize the US by bringing manufacturing jobs back into the country, then one must conclude that neither Trump nor his closest advisors know what they are doing. How often have we heard that claim in the Financial Times in recent weeks? His global vandalism, by this token, is not only reckless, but also mindless, because it is simply not possible to return the US economy to what it was 50 years ago without massive disruption to the US's varied and highly complex international production and supply chains, a disruption that would in turn lead to sharp domestic inflation and cost of living increases. But is reindustrialization of the US really Trump's major aim? He may have to say this to keep his voting base on side, but the view, my view here, is that the real objective behind Trump's upending of the current world order is to promote the interests of another two of his backing constituencies, namely those of the US corporations and of the US super-rich individuals. If the US hosts the world's largest equity markets, it is in large part because US corporations dominate the global corporate landscape, as exemplified by the fact that of the top 100 companies today by market capitalization, the 56 are US-based. If we go to the very top, to the top 21 corporations by market cap last year, we find that only 4 were non-US. 17 of the top 21, led by Microsoft, Apple, and so on, are US. Now go to the share of the world's 22 high net worth individuals, the US's share. This is about 35%, a figure over 10 times the US's percentage share of the world's population. And the reason for this is in large part due to the fact that of the 5 major asset types in which the wealthy store their surplus funds, their vast amounts of surplus funds, cash, real estate, bonds, equities, and alternative investments, the US dominates the world's supply of 3 of these asset types. Here we have a figure, an illustration of the US share of the world's high net worth population. That, what you see there resembles a ski slope. And that image has been consistent for the last 40 years, during which the Capgemini and other companies have been portraying the wealth of the world's rich. The US has always occupied pole position, some changes in the middle of the slope, and then look, going right across. And as I said, once you've earned your money, however you do, where do you put it? There are only really 5 asset types. Of the 5, only 2, the supply of only 2, namely cash and real estate, are globally dispersed. If we take the other 3, bonds, equities, and alternative investments, hedge funds and private equity, heavy concentration in the US. Now, not all US high net worth individuals have a direct connection with the US corporate sector. But as we go up the HNWI ladder to the ultra high net worth individuals, the multi-millionaires and billionaires, we find that the majority of this very small group of individuals are owners and or CEOs of the US top businesses that are globally active in such areas as those of advanced technology, banking and finance, manufacturing and services and distribution. It is illustrative of the importance of the power and influence of the US's richest individuals that a substantial proportion of Trump's inner cabinet today are themselves billionaires. When Trump's policies are viewed from the perspective of the priorities held by the US's top corporations and billionaires, what then becomes clear is the overriding aim of those policies. That aim is to undermine the current global institutional architecture. As things stand, there are no global institutions that have the same powers of intervention and distribution as our national governments. The only institutions that have any connection to the running of the global economy are either those that set down and umpire common standards and rules of conduct, the BIS in the sphere of banking, the WTO in the sphere of trade are two examples, or that provide countries with heavily conditioned financial assistance to help them function in line with prevailing standards and rules of conduct. The IMF and World Bank are notable examples. As the leading financier of these institutions, successive US governments have always insisted that the latter do not step too far outside of their limited remits. By contrast, the current Trump administration believes that these institutions have in fact outstepped their remits and is thus intent on neutering them. What fuels this belief and its resulting policy implications are the global strategic interests and priorities of the US large corporations, already able to use their economic and financial strengths to limit market competition. What they do not want to face are the various rules and regulations that restrict their attempts to control markets, or the various fines and penalties that may be incurred as a consequence of their attempts to control markets. The US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreements, from the World Health Organization, the stinging criticisms of the IMF and the World Bank, and the insistence that the OECD's agreements on corporate minimum tax rules have no force in the US are just some of the Trump administration's actions pursued in accordance with the US corporate sector's agenda. What then, and I'm coming to the final part, so don't worry, Sashi, what then of Trump's tariffs, those unveiled on so-called Liberation Day? What then of these tariffs that are taking his global economic vandalism to a whole new, unprecedented level? The general view appears to be that not only do these policies make no sense, but also that they run counter to US corporate interests. In advancing an alternative view, I begin by setting these policies in historical context. When the IMF and World Bank were established in 1944 as part of the Bretton Woods organizations, it was originally proposed that a third organization should also be established, the International Trade Organization. This proposal was vetoed by the US, and what was established instead was an informal set of trade-related agreements, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT. In 1995, GATT was replaced by the World Trade Organization with the support of the US. The reason? The US corporate sector, then not as internationally dominant as it had been in 1944, was concerned about the competitive threat posed by the giant Keiretsu-linked Japanese corporations, a threat that was perceived to be bolstered by the unfair, restrictive trading practices of these corporations. Scroll forward another 30 years to today, 2025. And what we now find is that the largest and most globally active US corporations no longer need a global rule-setting organization to help them compete with their Asian and other regional counterparts. Thus, what better way for the US to signal the WTO's redundancy than by pursuing tariffs that drive a coach and horses through everything that it stands for. So now we come to the rationale behind the punitive rates of the Trump tariffs. After several weeks of uncertainty as regards which countries and which commodity imports into the US would be hit with tariffs, Trump unveiled a comprehensive tariff plan April the 2nd, Liberation Day, but then announced a 90-day pause on this plan's implementation on April the 9th, with China not only being exempted from this pause, but also being hit with even steeper tariff rates. Far from this stop-start, zigzag line of approach on tariff policy, indicating lack of clarity as to what its purpose is supposed to be, Trump and his advisors know exactly what this approach is intended to achieve. This is to pressure foreign governments into making deep concessions as regards the treatment of US corporate activities that come within their scope. The deeper the concessions, the more lenient the tariffs, and vice versa. Here we have a good example. Last week, what does America say to India? Open up your domestic e-commerce market. No restrictions on Amazon or Walmart. The world's largest billion-plus domestic market. I want access. Give me access. The tariffs on your exports to the US removed. What's that got to do with reindustrializing America? Nothing. It's got everything to do with using tariff policy as a can opener to prise open these foreign markets. Now, if India caves into US pressure and opens its large e-commerce market to US entry, one reason for this will be the absence of a globally unified opposition to Trump's tariff policies. It's in this context that one sees the purpose behind the ostensibly bizarre formula used by the Trump administration for calculating the tariff rates to be imposed on its trading partners. What is the formula? The US deficits for the country are divided by the total imports from that country, and the resulting sum is then also divided by 2. This tariff formula may in itself make no economic sense. And how many economists and international trade experts have said, this doesn't make sense? Well, of course not. The point isn't to make sense in economic logical terms. The point is the impact of its implementation. And this implementation makes sense in that it results in highly unequal tariff rates against the different countries that trade with the US, and inequality and division that then helps to split these countries' ranks when agreeing trade deals with the US. There is no better example of this division than Sir Keir Starmer's government, the UK government, that far from forming a unified front with the European Union in confronting Trump and his policies, on the contrary, is seeking to independently negotiate favourable trade deals in the belief that the relatively low tariff rate set to be imposed on the UK's exports to the US signals hope that such a deal can be achieved. So here's Britain's trade deal. And what does it do? It helps undermine the WTO, because we're going to allow into the UK hormone-filled beef, ethanol-fueled products, right, running contrary to the standards set by the WTO. This is start, and that's just the beginning. So to conclude, and keep within the time frame, the foregoing analysis, what comes out of it, is that the first priority of all those forces opposed to the current Trump administration is to protect the existing global institutional architecture. At some point down the line, this architecture needs to be strengthened, both by further empowering the existing institutions and by adding new institutions, such as a global tax authority charged with coordinating corporate and wealth taxes. However, if any such ambition is ever to be realised, the necessary first step is to thwart Trump's assault on the existing institutional architecture. That's all. I meant to be less passionate. To learn to be calm.
Having Photis being less passionate is asking a tiger to calm down. It's not possible.
I've got to be calm. I have to be more English.
Okay, thank you everyone. So what I'll do is I'll collect online questions, but in the meantime we can just open up the floor for sort of Q&A, clarifications, questions, doubts, anything to Photis, and please introduce yourself first before you ask questions, and in the meantime I'll collect questions. Photis, you can sort of stand in here too.
I'll sit over there.
Yeah.
Oh, you sit there.
No, you can use.
I may need to use this.
Okay. No, you can. Professor Ronak.
This I'm not persuaded at all.
You're what?
Not convinced at all.
You never are, Ronan.
There's a good reason for it.
Give me the reason.
There were you gave two papers. The first one gave some data about finance, which was interesting. I think the framing of physical world and the financial world is interesting, living outside the intangible world, but that's a different argument we are going to have over during. But the second one is essentially where you're coming into is a debate that goes on now, and you are not the only one, i.e. whether Trump policies, is there kind of a rationale, a logic beyond it? Is the rationale of Trump policy fundamentally flawed or based on, a kind of semi-dictator, whatever he wakes up in the morning, or is there kind of a logic, underlying logic that many of us don't see, but in fact that runs through it? You belong to the second one. This administration knows what they're doing. They have a plan, and they're executing the plan. Now, there's a lot of evidence they don't, okay? And there's a lot of evidence, and that's based on basically reading of the utterance and thinking of a very small group of billionaires. The Peter Thiel is the one that kind of comes to mind. That they are basically not only a small group of outliers, but they are effectively representing what most of US capital in one way or another supporting or want to, including the large investment groups like BlackRock and so on and so forth. And I don't think it's correct. First of all, for business, generally speaking, and most business organizations tend to be cautious, and they should be, and rightly so, okay? To go into major disruption, it's much easier to destroy things and then to rebuild them. But to take to go into such huge disruption, okay, in the hope that out of the permutation of possible impact, there'll be the one that you really want. Because the permutation, along the way, there are a lot of things that can go wrong with this plan. A lot of it. And I think they are going wrong. To go for that, you really have to be fairly desperate fairly desperate to go for it. Because the chances of getting exactly what you want are very, very slim. Along the way, there's also issue of time, okay? The first 100 years of Trump, it's not simply a matter that the world stopped and waited. Investment is now slowing down in the US, everywhere, okay? All these disruptions, people think about kind of look at kind of the consumer, the effect on the consumer and the effect on the bond market, which are the two big things. But each change in these tariffs from one day to another has a huge implication on fixed contracts of all those importers, exporters, traders, okay? Small things. You know, I've got a friend who is importing nuts to the US. Not big deal. 3 million. The tariffs cost him, his company, $3 million. But now he's caught in about 50 different, fixed contract that he has with all kinds of suppliers. And the whole thing is a total mess, okay? So you go into that with the view of breaking, of what you're describing. And then the next argument, and I think this is key.
Shall we deal with that one first? Because
No,
that's very
because
interesting.
It's important that it's related to it about cautious. I'll be very cautious if I was a business CEO. Let's say your argument is, what happened if India caves in? What happened if the UK caves in? I mean, that's your argument. Because Trump basically is using this power to, if the country, and they do cave in. And your argument ends there. They cave in and nothing happens. But that's not correct. It's never correct. When countries cave in, something else begins to develop. There's internal dynamics in those countries. And what appears as caving in at some point may deal a whole set of other permutations that you didn't think about. When you begin to deal in such a relationship begins to work on the basis that countries feels or government feels or the constitution that they have caved in, that deals that you have signed with those countries is precisely what Sashi likes, this order. That deal is not a stable deal, okay? So the whole strategy, I think, is bonkers.
It's bonkers.
Yes.
Can I reply? Yeah. Let's take a starting point and an end date. I don't think Trump and his advisors know in exact detail every step along the path. So there'll be zigzag, there'll be forward advance, retreat, so on. But they know exactly the end aim of the tariffs. Those tariffs are there as a weapon causing disruption to secure something for the US's corporations and the US's elites. We're seeing that happen with India, UK. The UK, the farming, agricultural industry in America made it clear they expect the whole UK market to be opened up to their chlorinated chickens and so on. Okay? All right? And the list goes on. But let's take China. China. There's been so-called climb down, right? The US have reduced tariffs on China to 30% and China to 10%. Something of a disparity there. But they've also said, this is a pause. We may hit you again. What do you think, and I'm making this prediction, Trump's aim is with the tariffs against China? You know what he and his advisors want? TikTok. TikTok is the only social media platform in the US not owned and controlled by a US billionaire like Trump, like Elon Musk and so on. They control all the media outlet. TikTok, followed by half of the US's young people, is the only site that comes out with information about Gaza and so on. They made it clear, unless you sell us TikTok to US...
Global TikTok.
TikTok. Owned,
the
parent company is Chinese.
Yes.
And Trump's administration are making it clear they want the Chinese to divest from TikTok so that all the social media platforms in America are controlled within the US. This is an administration. What is it doing going after the universities? What is it doing creating a climate of fear internally? What is it doing, not just globally, but internally? It really is destroying any opposition to the enormous concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a tiny few, represented by Trump. They have a clear agenda. It will cause disruption. There will be US corporations that will suffer internally as well as gain externally. If you take Walmart domestically, some of its sales suffered because of the rising costs. But Walmart is thinking of a trade-off. I may have short-term disruption domestically, but that's nothing if I gain access to the Indian e-commerce market. The same with Bezos, Amazon. Domestically, there is problems with his company, domestically. But that's nothing compared to what Amazon stands to gain if it has huge access across the globe. What I'm saying is, I've said this is my position, you disagree. You may disagree, but they are causing disruption with a clear objective, and they are enabled to do that because of the power of the dollar. We are not seeing the dollar sink. Its exchange rate may fluctuate up and down, but the security of the dollar as a safe haven is absolutely intact. Anyway, this is the whole point of this debate. You follow the main line of argument. He doesn't know what he's doing. I think he knows exactly what he's doing.
That's not what I said, but let's other people.
We'll take one round of questions and then we'll come back to this debate. I think that's interesting. Any questions? Dollar dominance? The last point that Trump... Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a follow-up. I wonder if you could just broadly reflect on maybe the challenges of researching the Trump administration, sort of forming policy. In the presentation, like, this doesn't make sense, came up numerous times, it's reckless, and we're sort of debating, does this have a purpose? But like, from your own perspective, like, what are the challenges in sort of coming to conclusions based on sort of the Trump administration?
What was I didn't hear.
Oh, sorry.
What's the specific question?
It's more just like reflect broadly on sort of approach of sort of researching or forming the policy analysis on the Trump administration. Like, you're coming to sort of conclusions that this makes sense, but I just want to like broader reflection of like how you come to this. What are the challenges? Because Trump's sort of a unique...
To repeat the point, who is behind Trump? If you view his policies through the lens of his voting base, those who voted for him, it doesn't make sense. His policies are causing cost of living increases. The uncertainty is causing disruption to businesses, which will affect jobs and employment. And many people being affected adversely include Trump's supporters, those who voted for him. Okay? But I am arguing that his main constituents, who he's looking after, while he himself is enriching himself powerfully, right? He's turning himself into a super billionaire, right? Him, his son-in-laws, going to Middle East and so on, right? Who does he represent? And you look at his cabinet, these are hedge fund billionaires, they're bankers, right? They are the top. Do you see, to this day, any of the top backers, whether it be Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Bezos, right, who's bought the Washington Post and silenced all criticism of Trump, do you see them turning against Trump? Have we? Not a peep. Not a peep.
But Walmart?
What? Walmart, if they gain access to India?
They don't see the way they use it.
Time will tell. Time will tell.
So is the bottom line sort of disagreements, we can sort of come back to that. In a way, the question that Ronan is posing is that there are tiny little shakes that are happening within the global system that is still affecting the way the United States is perceived and how it's sort of, its role is decreasing, so to speak, if I can summarize it.
No, I think my main contention here is that Photis takes a view that is known, which is around Peter Thiel and what they want, the kind of, I don't know how they're called, the libertarian, okay, and makes and applies it to the US corporate economy as a whole, and believes that they share in that. Whereas I don't think they do. I don't think they do. I think they're extremely worried. beyond those libertarians who follow, for some reason, René Girard of all those, somebody that I always admired. I don't think corporate America is behind it. I think they're keeping stump like many others, okay? And I think they're keeping stump. They play the game like Starmer plays the game. It's not that Starmer will tell you how great Trump is, but any opportunity he'll have, he'll find ways, okay? So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that what we hear here is a projection from a small group that does have a plan and advertise the plan, believing that really applies to the whole corporate America, not understanding that in fact there is a politics within the United States along the way, because time doesn't stand still, and there's politics outside there that doesn't stand still, and hence the whole project is going to fall on its feet. And I think basically Trump is already rolling back.
Okay, so we take...
So he's talking about
raising
tax on the rich.
Let's take... Yeah, well... Come on. Come on, a small, tiny 2%. He's going to raise the tax on the rich, some rich, by 2%, 37 to 30. Come on now.
Why an economy...
Let's take US corporations abroad, the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Meta. 1 minute, let's take them. Constantly coming under, right, threats or facing penalties and fines for anti-competitive practices. Look at the EU. The EU is the only body in the world that's got the power to fine Google, Facebook, and so on, right? Trump is going to say, if you, the EU, do this, we're going to hit you with even more tariffs. We're going to hit you again and again, all right, unless you comply and remove these threats. Look at what the Trump administration is saying to the WTO. It is not in your remit to give funding to emerging market economies to tackle climate change. That's not in your remit. Right? Why should we, America, right, fund the WTO, or the IMF, okay, or World Bank, in order to redistribute some of the funds to the world's poorest countries to tackle climate change? So they're making it clear in cutting funding to the World Bank, in cutting funding to the United Nations, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. They're making it clear. What is it? What is it? The corporate world of America does not want these rules and restrictions. They get in the way. The oil companies, they're having a bonanza. Drill, baby, drill. Forget climate change.
We'll come back to this. I think it's a fascinating sort of debate in some ways. We'll come back to the sort of questions after taking some Q&A. Yes? Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Julie Day. I am a visiting researcher currently here, but I'm from the University of Michigan. And so you talked about the supporters of Trump, and currently he's losing most of them.
Say it again?
With the supporters of Trump.
Yes.
Currently he's losing most of them.
Some of them.
A lot. And they're going to have midterm elections.
Yes.
And then they're going to have the next presidential elections.
Yeah.
And so in the time frame, where do you see Trump arriving to the end of his plan?
Yeah. Look, he's going to make some concessions, like he's talking about raising taxes on the middle income strata. If you take the American super rich, most of the wealth is offshore. All right? It's not in America. It's in the Cayman Islands and so on, offshore shell companies and so on. They're not going to pay tax. Warren Buffett famously said, my cleaner pays more tax than I do. And that's Warren Buffett. So he's going to tax the middle income strata just to show that he's concerned about them. Some of his statements show, yes, there's some disruption. We'll try and rectify that. Personally, I think Trump has his goal on one term. Forget about him saying he wants to serve a third term. He wants another 3.8 years, and his main aim is to do for himself and for those behind him that agenda which I'm saying. Remove any barriers to growing wealth concentration, which equates with growing power concentration. In today's world, wealth is power. It's the super rich who can buy Twitter, turn it into X, right? It's Bezos, Amazon, who can buy the Washington Post. It's Murdoch who owns Fox TV. It's the global rich in America who control the media outlet. There's going to be slippages. There's going to be problems that cause the electorate to say, 1 minute we're being taken for suckers, which they are being taken for a ride, right? He's not really interested in the ordinary working person of America, but he has to say that because that's the voting support. You know, there's only a few hundred billionaires. You can't rely on them to vote. It has to be ordinary people vote. So your speech, your agenda has to be phrased in a way that says, I'm with you, right? The rest of the world unfairly is exploiting America, right? This is not fair, make America great again. You know what the reality is? America, year in, year out, takes out far more from the world than it puts back in. Because those foreign investors you see there, they earn a pittance on their treasury holdings and US securities, compared to what US investors earn from bonds and securities in India or Africa. The difference is huge. So each year, America rakes in trillions more than it pays out, but it goes to the rich. It doesn't go to ordinary people. It goes to the Elon Musks, who is set to pay himself again 55 billion. Not million, billion bonus. That's what we're talking about. That's the kind of wealth extreme we're talking about. And that wealth translates into power. Right?
Fascinating intervention.
Thanks. It's fascinating.
You can introduce yourself.
I'm Giuseppe Greco. I'm an historian of Empire International in the 19th century. And it's a fascinating conversation. I'm also trying to learn more about this. So I want to push your argument forward to see if I'm making sense of what you guided us through. So historians, and I'm thinking in particular about the work of Queen Slobodian, showed us that the global financial and economic order that we shaped, especially in the 80s and the 90s, was based on a neoliberal project that centered not on destroying order and destroying architecture at a global level, but it was based on the creation of a global institutional setting to protect the markets and to protect free trade capitalism from democracy and state sovereignty. So are you suggesting with your argument that what we're entering in is a new phase of that project? Because you're saying American capitalism, American corporations, they were already protected by that system. They were already doing well under that system. Want to endorse something that goes beyond that?
Yes.
Something that it's no longer simply neoliberal, but it's maybe sort of modern feudalism. I don't know, how you would describe that. Thank you.
The short answer to your question is that the last 30 to 35 years have seen two massive paradigm shifts in the global economic and political landscape. Two. One is the globalization of capitalism following the collapse of communism, the 90s. The second one is financialization of capitalism. What does that mean? It means the growing size of the world's equity and bond markets relative to the world's production base. In 1980, the aggregate size of world equity and bonds was 11 trillion, the same as world GDP, 1980. By 2000, world equity and bond stocks together was 2 times world GDP. By 2020, 3 times the size of GDP. Who is dominating financialization to the same extent that the securities markets dominate the world's product markets? The US. 40 to 45%. If you take all the Asian economies, China included, 15%. That translates into currency shares. All the EME currencies, 13% of 7.5 trillion. Indian rupee is 1%. The Brazilian real, 0.5%. The Chinese renminbi, the strongest Asian currency, 3.2%. Nothing. So in this financial sphere, which is without historical precedent, it's new, all right? The US and the dollar dominate. It has no historical precedent. So when people look to the past to try and explain today and the future, that is an anachronism. What we're facing is a new reality. There is no historical precedent. And this is what a lot of people don't understand, especially when it comes to the dollar, when they say, oh, look at the UK sterling. The UK sterling was powerful in the 19th century. It continued to be powerful till the Second World War because of inertia. Only when the US decided to face outwards at the end of World War II did the dollar displace the pound sterling. What happened then? A lot of people are saying it's going to happen now. What were they saying 3 years ago? BRICS are going to de-dollarize the global financial system. Where's that today? Who's saying that today? Just 3 years on? No one. Now, instead of the attack from the front on the dollar, now everyone's talking about the rear attack from Trump from behind. It doesn't matter if you're going to have a frontal assault or a rear assault. Dollar dominance will remain, and it's being used by Trump and his billionaire supporters with a purpose, despite what Ronan says.
Still, Giuseppe's question is a very interesting one, because he's asking something about these things are not new in a sense from a historical lens, that
Some are.
1970s already with Quinn Sabodian's argument is effectively we had these institutions to protect the dollar dominance in the 1970s. It was working perfectly fine. And the question is really interesting in the sense, are we in a new world where those established institutions that really took democracy for granted in the broader critique, historical critique of how neoliberal capitalism evolved, are we in a new world where we are going into sort of like complete collapse of these institutions to protect the American dollar?
Let's go back to the 70s. You know when Nixon took the dollar off gold, August the 15th, 1971, throughout the 70s, the US did not have a clue as to what could replace gold as the foundations of dollar. They didn't know. And even by 79, 80, they were seriously talking about restoring some form of gold base to the dollar. And then what happened? What happened, 79, 80, under President Reagan, the Volcker shock. They raised interest rates sky high. The neoliberal rhetoric is the rhetoric. Markets should decide, not governments, okay? The market can only survive if we control inflation, raise interest rates, right? But the real agenda was, if they wanted to squeeze out inflation, to create space for the US government to issue bonds, treasuries. From 1980, US Treasury bonds go. Why? Because they're better when there's low inflation, right? What happens? The US then began to realize the new foundations of dollar dominance is not gold, it's not production, it's US securities led by US Treasury bonds. That's the lesson they learned through the 80s into the 90s, and it's the lesson slowly, grudgingly being learned by the EU, the Eurozone today. Because in the Eurozone, you've got Germany saying debt is bad, government debt is bad, right? And what have they done? They've held back the euro as against the dollar. So it just may be that Trump's policies may send a wake-up call to the Eurozone governments, the ECB. Let's start issuing bonds, not only German bonds, but joint sovereign bonds in order to take on the dollar. We are in a new era. And unless we understand that, we're going nowhere. The poor will get poorer, the rich will get richer, and we'll be left to scrabble for the scraps left to us, which is where the far right comes in, Inga. Because the far right, the populist far right, what do they feed off? The fact that there are cuts in spending to make way for increases in defense spending. Isn't it? We have to feed off the
We'll take more
scraps.
questions?
As many as you want.
Giuseppe, do you want to follow up or we go with Neil? Neil and then Inga.
Yeah, so mine's just a point of, Neil Quinn, lecturer in comparative politics here at City. Just mine's a point of clarification, really. If you take, is your point like that we're in a new era? Is it the new era is Trump? Because if you remove Trump as the variable, is there that much difference to what you're describing between the Biden economy and now in terms of oligarchic capital? Because this presentation has been kind of about Trump, but for me, it seems kind of overdetermined.
Now, here's me thinking I was as clear as a bell as to what is going on, and I'm wrong. I'm totally wrong. It is this. The point is...
For the idiots at the back.
No. I'm trying to tell you what is global financial space. This space dominated by securities, which are far larger now than physical space, GDP space, which is dominated by the US. Then that's a parallel vision, horizontal, physical, all right, financial. Then I tried to go vertically, layers, from the government level down to the corporate, down to the individual, right? So Trump is representing America at the global level as a country because of his voting base. The working people vote for him. But I then go on to argue that Trump, the real constituencies, who he's really concerned about are the corporations, the top, and the super rich billionaires. Okay? He is their instrument, their mouthpiece, and he's willing to do whatever they want because he and his family will gain as well. All right? He knows that had the election gone the other way, November the 6th last year, he'd be in prison today, stripped of his wealth. Seriously.
But why does that matter to the capital behind him, is my point.
Because they want someone, right? They want a politician who has no scruples. The less scruples, the more you can go on the attack against these global institutions. Look at them. This is not Trump making the decision to leave the World Health Organization. This is not Trump taking the decision to leave Paris climate change, to attack the World Bank, IMF. I mean, he may not like them all, but that's not him. This is not a real genius, intellectual.
Does all of that change the market capitalisation of the firms that you outlined?
Not at all.
That's the point of the Trump variable.
Have you noticed 2 days? Have you noticed the moment there was a sigh of relief with the temporary pause in the China and US trade tariff war? Wow, the confidence in America shot up, equity prices went up, the dollar went up, right? And all those who have been forecasting dollar doom have gone silent until the next time. You see? No, Trump is a figurehead, an instrument, who will benefit as much as those behind.
Confidence in America.
Huh?
It wasn't confidence in America, It was basically the hope and belief that the U.S., that Trump's plans are temporary and he's going to roll back. If he's rolling back on all his plans, then yes, market capitalization will rise. That's what is reflected, okay? The reduction of tariffs reflects that you are going back on what you are planning, which was raising tariffs, they are paying tax, and I can reduce taxation domestically, and the whole thing. It's the rolling back, which, with the market sense that he's rolling back on his ideas, then the market rises. When the market says that he's pushing for those stupid ideas, then dollars decline and the market capitalization. Photis, I disagree with you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, don't be sorry.
Very good for an academic. Sort of.
But listen,
very, very good. We'll take
one point. I want you all have photographic memory and register this point in time. He is saying, my good friend Ronan, that Trump is rolling back.
If the market sees it,
He is not rolling back. He announces temporary pauses, but makes it clear, I will either withdraw or lower tariffs according to what concessions you give me. Watch this space. Tomorrow, next week, watch this space, and you will see he will only change his tariff policy if the other trading partner makes deep concessions to US corporations, to US farmers, to US oil drilling companies, and so on. Watch this space. He is not going to roll back because he and his advisors are worried about uncertainty and the damage being done to America. They're not doing that. They're not doing it. They are not. Look at the facts.
I think it's great. Inga, so we can start.
I'm Inga Radmacher and I'm a lecturer here. So my question is, if this is a new regime, we obviously don't just see these types of policies and they differ. In the US, we see authoritarianism and extractivism throughout the Western world. So what you pointed towards one factor of a source of this new regime, which is this is kind of the dominant elite that's driving this.
Yeah.
Is this your main point, or would you also think about the larger capitalist dynamics that we're faced? So low economic growth rates for the past 40, 50 years. So that's kind of what I see, that if you have 2% of GDP growth, everyone is starting to think about where can we get more. And plus, then we see simultaneously the demise of the liberal world order, which also points towards smaller economic growth. Countries are starting to seek a larger share. They can't get it domestically. Where are they getting it? Externally, and that's, of course, what you see in the 1930s as well. So, yeah, what is kind of the larger dynamic? Besides the business interests which might align?
My own view is, I come back to the central theme as regards policy conclusion. We've reached a new paradigm in the global system of interconnection in many spheres. The global economy is interconnected in terms of technology, transportation, finance, financial rules, and so on. But there are no global institutions with powers of intervention. Okay. That's what we need. The world's poorest, billions of them, living across Africa, Latin America, Asia, billions of people trapped and bordered in their nation states, haven't got the money to deal with climate change and so on. In the West, living costs are going up, social spending coming down. What are we doing? We're spending more and more money on defense, on policing. Just go outside and any moment, look up the sky, you'll find 5 jets protecting us against Russian attack. All right, 5 jets. Think of the cost of those 5 jets patrolling around the day. So we're being squeezed. 8.2 billion people, 7.5 living in poverty. We're being squeezed. How are we going to have global redistribution? My argument is that the American super rich, backed by super rich across the world, Putin's oligarchs, right? Some of the rich across Asia, they all have the same offshore companies, the same offshore bank accounts, and so on, right? They don't want to see the current institutional architecture going the other way, becoming stronger, right? Introducing more redistribution rules. Like the IMF, to its credit, actually for once saying, let's put some more money for climate change. So they've gone silent on that. So unless we have change at the global level, we're going nowhere. Countries at the individual level cannot do it. All you get, if you take the UK, you have Rishi Sunak's Tory government replaced by Keir Starmer's Labour government. What's the difference? What is the difference on any major front of policy? International aid, 0. 0. Right? In fact, it's getting worse. All right? benefits, cuts. Name one area of policy where Starmer's government is different from Rishi Sunak's. Zero. Why? They're hemmed in. All these governments are hemmed in as to what they can do. And unless we have collective action to rebuild the global institutional architecture, it's going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse.
I'll read one more question online, which
Okay.
do you have a follow-up, Inga? Good. We can take another round. One more question is, you talked about dollar dominance. One of the questions is, what are the complexities of the Fed's role right now in terms of the US Fed, and what alternatives are on the horizon? With alternatives, you did lay out before saying there are no alternatives looking at the gravity of the American dollar, but the question on what are the complexities of the Fed's role right now is interesting.
Let me take the two questions there, and the second one. The only alternative in relation to
Okay, so I think we'll set the ball rolling. Thank you everyone for coming. It is a pleasure really to talk about today's topic, disorder and dollar dominance under Donald Trump's second presidency. This cannot be more timely topic to present, and we have Professor Photis here going to give us our talk. We have also sort of circulated the paper that'll form the sort of background for this talk. Just 2 seconds or 2 minutes of like mini introduction of what the global disorder is, what CityPerk is. Global Disorder Cluster, or this Global Disorder Group, is a group that we started in 2022, predominantly from the international relations perspective, like looking at questions on what are the sort of crises in the making of international order, how do we sort of conceptualize new forms of challenges that comes to international order, from climate to sort of problems relating to artificial intelligence, and other sorts of tensions from authoritarian regimes, crisis of democracy, and so on. CityPerk has a longer tradition here, and it has been going on and it has a huge reputation not just here in the UK but also abroad. And this is the first sort of seminar where we both are combining our sort of interests. One is that there is a growing recognition that much of the problems that comes from today's world, particularly in issues of global order and ordering, is probably from economics and economic issues. And there's no one else better to talk about sort of problems that come from dollar other than Photis. He has a recent book that we all sent out in our email. We are sort of also happy to sort of have him sort of send you a discount code as well if you're really interested after this talk to purchase the book. But this talk will not be about the book per se. This talk is something that Photis has been thinking for quite some time in our conversations. One is to both theoretically and empirically understand the connections between the stability of the dollar regime and the financial world and the instability in the political world. And we are going to have Photis talk about that sort of tensions between order and disorder, and sometimes the coexistence of order and disorder, how order really rests on disorder at some level, and how global disorders from climate, environment, or issues relating to wars and others might not necessarily mean that there is disorder at the financial realm as well. And we think this is a fascinating argument for an interdisciplinary sort of research that looks both that the world is tightly interconnected in many ways, and this interconnections is somehow reflected in how certain things, certain status quo is continued in one way or the other, and dollar is one of them. So about 20 to 25 minutes, Photis will make a presentation and pitch. There will be some online questions as well, and there are 2 areas people have signed up. One is the Teams, and we have 2 members here, and some others have signed up in Zoom as well, and they'll send some Q&A. But the point really what Photis wants to do is to have a discussion. So after sort of brief 20 minutes or 25 minutes, we are going to open the floor for really fierce discussion, as Photis' style of discussing is very passionate. So I'll only be doing what is called as sort of a managerial role, being the chair, sort of asking you sort of happy to answer questions that you're directing to Photis. But please introduce yourself when you're asking a question, and then start sort of like your questions, your challenges, your sort of concerns or clarifications. If there are others that I'll have to be paying attention to, I'll be paying attention more to the online sort of Q&A. So without much ado, Please welcome Photis.
Thank you, Sashi. Okay. So, over 100 days into Donald Trump's second presidency, there is no doubt that his policies amount to nothing other than wanton vandalism on a global scale. But is this mindless vandalism or vandalism with a purpose? To answer this question, we must first distinguish between the motivating and enabling factors behind Trump's policies. Whatever the precise reasons for them, which I'll come to in a moment, the fact remains that the US is the only country on the planet that has the power to cause disruption on so vast a scale. That power comes down to the unrivaled power of the US dollar in global financial space. First, let's take a look at global physical space. As things stand, the world